Good morning. So, according to the syllabus, we were supposed to be wrapping up the monitoring section, but thanks to some creative lecture writing on my part, we managed to wrap it up before the test. So we're actually back on schedule with the original syllabus. And we skipped ahead. So today what we'll be covering is moving on from the monitoring and getting into the actual aspects of pest control, sort of how we actually go about doing control. So we'll be moving into cultural and mechanical control for the next 2 days. So these are kind of the part of this lecture series that feel like the common sense lectures. But, you know, oftentimes it's easy to overlook things that seem pretty simple. So we did have a quiz today. It was the Would You Like 2 Points quiz. By virtue of how Blackboard is designed and how these quizzes are designed, I did have to select a right answer as opposed to, and they only let you put in a minimum of 4 choices. So what I said as the correct answer was yes, you would like 2 points. Though we did have 16% of the respondents say that they would like more than 2 points. Shame on you. You only get 2 points. Don't be greedy. But I did set it up that if you answered incorrectly, you got partial credit worth 2 points. So it panned out. No matter what you answered, you got 2 points. So hopefully y'all went and took the quiz, just so you didn't have to rack your brains. From what I heard from everybody, it was a pretty heavy test week. So hope you all survived, and if you have more tests to go, that you will continue to survive. Anyway, as far as announcements are concerned, a reminder that lab will be meeting in 229. We'll be going over degree days before next week, where we'll be heading out to the orchards to start on a semester-long project. So I will have a van reserved for that in case you don't want to drive out to the orchards yourself. It'll be the same deal as before. We'll leave about 10 minutes before lab starts from room 119. I left my Pandora on. That would add some interesting ambiance to the recorded lecture.
PowerPoint? Only a PDF this week?
No. So, yes, I accidentally uploaded the PDF on both. If you go right now, you should be able to download the PowerPoint under the corrected file. And one final note, there are some minor changes to the PowerPoint as usual. This week, this lecture, the changes are almost all just structural to help the flow of the presentation. I didn't change any of the actual testable material on there. So all the definitions are the same, all the blanks are the same. There just might be 2 or 3 extra slides that are transitional. So where are we? Where were we? Where are we going? At the beginning of class, we were really focusing on what IPM was. And then as we sort of rounded out the aspects of pest ecology and those sorts of things, we moved into the actual decision-making process of IPM, right? And that's where we are right now. We're moving through these steps. We covered monitoring, how to do sampling schemes, touched a little bit on sampling techniques and efficiency, and then we moved into assessment, or what are the economic tools that we use to decide when it's time to treat. So if we have 5 grasshoppers per suite, does that mean we should treat, or is that below the economic threshold? We talked about those sorts of things. And now we're moving into this next to last step of the decision-making tree, the implementation. And implementation is really just all about, all right, we have a problem, we need to take care of it, what are the tools that we have at our disposal in order to manage pests in our fields? And so this is really where we start getting into the integration of IPM, right? The first letter. Since IPM is a lot of things, it's that decision-making tool, it's ecology-based, it's data-intensive, all of that. But a lot of people really focus on this integrated aspect, the idea that we have a variety of tools, a variety of approaches that all can be used synergistically in order to provide greater control. And by synergy, I just mean that essentially you can use more than one technique at the same time, and by combining them together, you get a greater impact of them working together than you would get from the 2 techniques separately working on their own. right? So integration is all about bringing together tools that work together better than they work separately. And so for the next couple of lectures, we'll be covering some of those tools. We'll be going through the major types of management: cultural, mechanical, biological, chemical, and then we're also going to cover genetic controls, as that is a growing area of research and of pest control that really doesn't fit neatly into any of those other categories. And we'll probably throw in some pheromones for fun as well. So cultural control. Cultural control is rooted in the idea of cultural practices, which are just management techniques that you use to basically achieve crop production goals. So you're basically just manipulating the field in order to make your crop grow better. And these are all the sorts of obvious crop management type tools: fertilization, irrigation, site selection, tillage, all of that. And so feeding off of that, there's this idea that there are basic cultural practices that we can apply to the field that actually are useful for controlling pests. So they are ways that we modify the environment in order to make it less favorable to pest invasion, reproduction, survival, and dispersal. Right? So this is really that applied ecology we were talking about in the ecology section. That there are certain ecological factors in an agroecosystem that make it really suitable to pests, and if we can identify those factors and reduce them or eliminate them, we're going to reduce our pest populations. And that's all that cultural control is really about. Consequently, because a lot of those factors can't just be removed from a system immediately, you have to do it during certain times of the season. Some of them need to be done before you actually even start the planting. Cultural control is almost entirely preventative. These are things you do well ahead of time in order to stop them from establishing in the first place, because in theory, you don't have to control pests that never showed up, right? So if you can stop them, you're better off in the first place. And typically, what cultural control looks like is it looks like sort of those familiar things that everybody's been doing for centuries or millennia in their fields, and that we all know about. So they are familiar, inexpensive, simple, and oftentimes they don't look like control at all. They're just the things that we know to do. Hence, the idea of the common sense lecture that this is going to be. So, I lumped these cultural controls into roughly two groups. The first of which are these 6, which I consider to be prevention before planting. These are things that you would ideally do before you ever planted the field in order to make sure that the field is unfriendly to pests and is not going to allow them to establish very well. Later on, we'll have the handful of cultural controls that apply to systems that are already well established. So site selection. This is more or less exactly what it sounds like. You want to make sure that you select a site that is not already infested with pests, right? When you're going out and you're scouting, if you have a basic idea of the history of the plot, you can, if you know that there are certain weeds in there that you can't control very well in the particular crop that you're trying to grow, maybe you don't want to grow that crop there. So essentially, do not plant in fields that have significant pest history. If it's really unavoidable, then you can actually select crops, or you can select varieties of crops that fit better within that particular crop history. If you know you have root knot nematodes, you can plant cotton or tomato that have root knot nematode resistance, right? The other side of this is that maybe the site doesn't have pests, but maybe the site just isn't super ideal for the crop, right? Maybe you're growing almonds in really sandy soil, which tends to stress them out a little bit, right? And so the idea there is that almonds growing in sand, there may not be more pests around, but they're going to be stressed out. They're going to be more vulnerable to pests, so you're going to have more pest problems moving into the future. And I've heard this from some growers that a lot of people suspect that the number of spider mites that you get oftentimes can be correlated with how sandy the soil is. I don't know any research on that, but that's just sort of the folk wisdom I've been hearing. And then finally, ultimately, this is also the area where you would be doing a lot of that early season monitoring, right? Soil samples for weed seeds, for nematodes, all that sort of stuff, just to sort of assess how good of a match am I dealing with here? And also to identify the pests that are already in the system. And consequently, beyond that, when you already have some things in the ground, or if you're prepping the land, sanitation is an excellent step to further reduce the pests, right? So sanitation just roughly being techniques that minimize the initial introduction of pests. So some of these are clear, such as planting certified seed, tubers, and rootstocks. These all come from people who basically their job is to produce high-quality, disease-free, seeds, tubers, and rootstocks, to repeat myself again, right? Don't just plant seeds from your cousin Jim Bob, unless Jim Bob's certified, or if you really trust Jim Bob, but then you don't have anyone to blame but yourself if something goes wrong. But essentially, going through these pathways is a good way to determine that you're going to have everything you need, be relatively free of nematodes, pathogens, weeds, all of that. Secondly, beyond that, any equipment that you move into a field needs to be clean, right? There are lots of pests that are just highly immobile. You've got things like weeds that, when they're not necessarily, they don't necessarily all spread by seed very well, though a lot of them do. But then you've got things like scale insects that don't move at all. You've got nematodes that move very slowly through the soil. And so they have a low chance of getting into a field where they're not already established. But if you were tilling a field with a whole bunch of nematodes in it, and then picked up that tillage instrument, moved it to another field, and plopped it down without cleaning off all the dirt, you're just inoculating. You're introducing a problem you didn't have before. So steam and pressure cleaning, really handy ways to avoid those immobile pests. And then there's the sanitation we already kind of covered in the almonds, which would be basically removing all of those sites that the insects or the pests like to hang out in. They're overwintering, breeding sites, refuge sites, by basically collecting them and destroying them or moving them to an area where they aren't going to cause any trouble. We can reduce a lot of the sort of initial inoculation of a pest in a system. And then finally, one of the little bit less clear options that does fall under sanitation is just keeping an eye on your irrigation water. This is a little bit less of a problem now that a lot of people are using sort of micro sprinklers or drip tape, things like that, where you don't have a whole lot of extra water laying around. But still, just avoiding using tailwaters from areas that have pathogen or nematode problems, because you're just washing everything out of that area and putting it in a new field where you might not have that problem. Right. And so, just to touch back, sanitation can be a really powerful tool. It's sort of the hallmark of this is the one we worked on earlier, the navel orangeworm, right? Where you have navel orangeworm overwintering in the mummy nuts in almond. But they did do a study on this where they shook down the trees. I believe it was that Siegel and Higbee study where they shook down the trees, reduced it to a certain nut concentration or a certain mummy concentration and looked at the percent damage. And they really showed that by getting below around about that 5 to 10 mummy nut level, you get something along the lines of like a 5 to 10-fold reduction in the amount of damage. And I actually just talked to Siegel on the phone this morning, and he was arguing that about 1% of damage from navel orangeworm in almonds costs the state industry about $100 million. So these relatively small reductions in percentages can translate out to very large numbers economically, though it helps that almonds are the most widely planted and one of the highest value crops in California. So most types of damage add up pretty quick there. Consequently, just as an aside, sanitation really is the way that we primarily also handle household pests. So really, removing food and grime is the easiest way just to avoid cockroaches and ants and all sorts of things in the first place. Not bed bugs. Bed bugs are just problematic because you are the bed bug's food source. You can't remove yourself. Well, you could. I don't recommend it. I don't know if bed bugs can live in cardboard boxes. So like living on the street, don't know if that would help or not either. Haven't thought that one through. But most people don't accept homelessness as a effective pest control technique. So, Alternative hosts. So this is moving outside of the things that we actually do in the field, but this basically addresses the fact that lots of pests have complex life cycles. They don't just feed on the particular crop, because a lot of crops, they show up, they grow, they flower, they fruit, we harvest them, and then there's nothing left in that field afterwards for the rest of the growing season. Or we plant something else that's a completely different host. And so a lot of these pests, especially insects, need to go somewhere else. They need an alternative host, where maybe they reproduce, maybe they lay their eggs, or they overwinter. And so by identifying these alternative hosts and removing them from the system, we can remove a huge reservoir of pests for the next growing season. And so typically this would be things like burning weedy banks or mowing them. This particular case, in the Salinas Valley, there were certain growers who were finding they were having a lot of trouble with lettuce root aphids. So it's exactly what it sounds like. They're aphids that feed on the roots of the lettuce, just generally feeding on the phloem, reducing the growth. And when they went out and started looking around, they discovered that what was happening was during the winter, these aphids were moving out of the lettuce fields and into poplars that were being used as windbreaks. They would reproduce under the bark. In the springtime, they would crawl up and feed on the poplar leaves, and then they would migrate en masse into the young lettuce as it was being planted. And so by cutting down those poplars and replacing them with a different tree species that the aphid doesn't feed on, they reduce their pest pressure significantly in a really short amount of time. And along those same lines, there are things that we can do to modify the habitat that don't necessarily relate specifically to alternative host plants. So habitat modification is basically a really broad category that just talks about that ecological concept we talked about in previous classes. The idea that there are certain ecological factors that favor pests. If we identify them and remove them, then the pest isn't going to do as well. Excuse me. And kind of the poster child for this, as far as control tactics is concerned, is mosquito, just because it's relatively easy to remove these sources, but at the same time, you just have to have one neighbor who can cause trouble. This actually happened. When I first moved here, the rental we moved into, the backyard was really pleasant to be in until the summer came and all the mosquitoes moved in. And what it turned out to be was someone in our neighborhood had a whole bunch of sort of empty flower pots and the like that were collecting water every time the sprinklers went off, and the mosquitoes would hatch out of that. And then for whoever owned the house we were in planted a whole bunch of plants that were attractive to mosquitoes, the ones they like to hang out in. So we were like the mosquito magnet for the neighborhood, which is distinctly unpleasant. So with mosquitoes, in theory, it's easy to get rid of them because they lay their eggs in standing water. The larvae require the standing water to develop fully. And then by just removing that water, it's a-okay, easy going. But then you have some people who like to, they don't care. They don't mind leaving things out. This is another aside. So I grew up in central Pennsylvania, sort of in the Appalachian part, and it's got a real Appalachia flavor to it. And there was this dude on the southern end of the county who had an ongoing war with the EPA over the fact that he had built a fence out of tires. And this wasn't any little fence. I want to say they estimated the total volume of the tire fence being somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 tires, all just stacked up in a big heap all around this property. It was to keep deer out. And the big concern was you have all these tires laying around just collecting water, and it was turning into a huge mosquito factory and all of that. And so he ended up going to jail for it, and because he basically just refused to get rid of them, refused to pay the fine. He also built a dam on his property, like a homemade earthen dam, and every time the spring would come, it would flood like all of his neighbors who were upstream of him. He's just a terrible guy. But he became kind of like a folk hero for people who wanted to stand up to the EPA. They were like, "Free the tire fence, man!" they had billboards on the highway. It was really impressive. So that's just an aside about why mosquitoes can be tricky to control, because some people like tire fences. So beyond that, On a less sort of medical side and a more practical agricultural side, lots of mammals have very specific habitat needs, and especially small rodents that you find in orchards or vineyards, they really like having heavy mulches, weeds, lots of sort of grassy growth that they can form tunnels in, and it protects them from predators and especially birds of prey. And so by removing a lot of this vegetation, or at least creating buffers around your field that are significant expanses of either very short vegetation that you mow or creating sort of dirt patches that they have to cross, you basically create a little barrier that they're less likely to cross, and then if they do try to cross, they're more likely to get nabbed by an owl or a falcon or something. Okay, smother and cover crops. Judging from previous classes that I have, or previous exams I have given in this class, I get the impression that you learn about smother and cover crops in a lot of your classes. So, hope you're ready to learn about them again. So smother crops, right? Smother crops being fast-growing crops that are planted in rotation with the primary crop, just in order to suppress weeds. So basically, you're at the end of your growing season, you've got, a whole sort of winter before you're going to go out there and plant your cotton or your tomatoes or your melons or whatever. So you might as well throw out some winter wheat or something that's just going to grow in that place, keep the weeds down. You come back in the spring, you harvest it, and you sell it. Make a little bit of money instead of just having fallow land out there, right? On the flip side, you have cover crops. Cover crops are basically the same idea. It's some sort of plant that you grow in place in order to remove the chances that weeds are going to grow, except cover crops aren't necessarily a crop plant. They are non-crops. You can't harvest them and sell them for anything. But they can provide any number of other functions. On the one hand, as I mentioned before, they suppress weeds, but oftentimes they are planted with the intention of providing nitrogen to the soil. If you have like vetch or clover, something like that, perhaps they provide a habitat to natural enemies in that site. Or even in some cases, there's been some people who have investigated planting flowers in between almond rows in order to provide something for bees to feed on when we ship them in. Because you ship them in a week or two in advance and they just sort of hang out and have nothing to eat. So it'd be nice to give them some flowers. But as far as I can tell, those haven't really taken off yet. Primarily because of the efficiencies of watering. Flowers in the middle of the rows don't get enough water to really sustain themselves. Right. Yeah. So just as an example, oftentimes, boy, that did not turn out. We had some lights. That's a little better. We got so much light from the window, I really don't need to have lights on in here. So what you can vaguely see is we've got a vineyard here with a bunch of vetch growing in the middle. And so cover crops they typically are more common in permanent crops, right? Like I mentioned before, the idea of the flowers in between the almond rows, in this case having vetch or clover growing in between your vineyard rows. Just because these are spaces that you aren't going to grow anything on anyway, and so if you can plant something there that provides a benefit, then you might as well. Vetch is a nice example because it does a lot of things. It adds nitrogen to the soil, since it is a legume, and because it's got all these nice flowers on it, that nectar will attract all sorts of beneficials. Typically lady beetles, it'll pull in parasitic wasps, it'll give parasitic wasps also somewhere to reproduce whenever they are searching out for things to feed on. And also, it provides ants with nectar, which is nice because otherwise ants are going to crawl up in your vines and start protecting the mealybugs, which is a pain to deal with. But of course, on the flip side, you have to keep in mind that cover crops sometimes can have unintended consequences which are negative, such as vetch providing habitat for omnivorous leaf rollers to overwinter in. So on the pro side, cover crops can do a lot, right? Provide you with all that weed suppression, natural habitat, improved soil fertility, all of these things. On the flip side, there are some bad things. What might be some negatives of cover crops?
Water.
Right. So cover crops do require resources. So water you use to keep a cover crop alive is water that you arguably could be using to keep your trees or your vines alive. Competition, right? So they may be competing for resources. If you're growing a cover crop in the context of something more along the lines of like a seedling plant, you might even be competing for light.
Maybe also provide habitat for pests,
Right, exactly. You're providing habitat for beneficials, but you may also provide habitats for pests, like we mentioned earlier.
Disease.
Yep, diseases. You might have diseases that can be harbored in the cover crop.
So overall, time and maintenance.
Yeah, there you go. So more resources, right? It's water, but it's also all the time you have to spend maintaining it. And so yeah, there's sort of a heap of things that potentially, aren't particularly ideal. Yeah, I think we basically nailed all of those down.
I thought one of the reasons for a cover crop was to actually sustain some moisture.
In some cases, yes. Right? If you have I guess if it's a choice of like a cover crop versus just sort of straight up bare soil that's going to get baked by the sun.
You're still having to water it though. I mean, whereas during the overwinters or whatever, you're instead storing up the waters or your trees are using it, but now you have those cover crops taking up that water.
So I guess it would depend on sort of the nature of the system. If the cover crop requires a lot of water, or if it can just sort of live off the runoff from whatever it is you're already giving to your crop. So I could see it working either way.
Depends on your location, I think. Your area.
Because right here we get winter and rain in the winter, so I know some of the cover crop we have here on campus, we don't water at all.
Yeah, do it dry land style. Yeah.
It also limits groundwater recharge.
That's true. That's true. So water that's going into a plant is water that won't necessarily go into recharge. Yeah. Well, so that brings me to my last point, which is that really cover crops and smother crops are a great option in a lot of systems. They may not work in your particular situation. And so that's something that you'll have to consider. And as with a lot of things with IPM, it's going to be a discussion that you're going to have with the person who is growing the crops, or if you're in charge of the farm or ranch, it's something that you're going to have to consider for your particular situation. Do the benefits align with your goals as a producer or with the producer's goals? That's the big question. And so these are options you can bring forward, but they may not be utilized in every case. And just because you aren't utilizing them doesn't mean you aren't doing the right thing. Because sometimes, I don't know, sometimes you'll get the impression that it's kind of like, well, if I'm not using cover crops and I'm not making beetle banks and I'm not, using only organic insecticides and all this, I'm not really doing IPM. That's not really the case. It's all a spectrum, right? It's all a spectrum. All right, so beyond cover and smother crops, we have some of the things we talked about in economic entomology, the idea of intercropping. So intercropping is something you don't see a whole lot in the United States. You see it in some other countries. You see it a little bit in systems like cotton and alfalfa, but it's basically growing multiple crops in the field at the same time. And you can either do this sort of by growing them in strips, I'd say a strip of cotton, a strip of alfalfa, strip of cotton, strip of alfalfa, or in some cases you can just plant them all together. There's a group out in Kansas, I believe, called the Land Institute, and they're really interested in producing sustainable grassland agriculture. And I think their idea is that you would have a mix of grasses that are perennials that produce seeds that we can eat, and you would just plant it out, grow them all together, and harvest them all together. And then, because it's perennial, they'll just come back up the next year. I don't think they've had a whole lot of luck, but that would be sort of the extreme end of intercropping. You just mix everything together and try and harvest it all at the same time. But of course, as you know, lots of plants don't line up real nicely. And so it can be very challenging to do that. But so a really good example of this, as I mentioned before, is in California you used to see a lot of intercropping of cotton and alfalfa. And this was a lygus bug control program that lygus likes cotton, but it likes alfalfa a whole lot more. And the problem is lygus feeds directly on the cotton square, the flower bud that comes up, and ultimately produces the cotton boll. So if you get a lygus feeding on the cotton boll early in the season, it can completely destroy it. And so a full ball is never produced. You get a lot of dropping of the squares. But if they feed on alfalfa, lygus doesn't really cause a whole lot of damage unless it's seed alfalfa. So what a lot of cotton growers will do, or what they used to do, is they would grow strips of alfalfa in the middle of their field. Lygus would move into there, and they would either just spray that strip to get rid of the lygus bug, or they would just leave the lygus in there because they tended to stay in the alfalfa if they could. I want to say with more mechanization, they moved away from this, and now what you see a lot of is big fields of alfalfa adjacent to big cotton fields. And so it's the same idea, but more of a trap cropping.
Do they make Roundup Ready alfalfa?
I feel like they do. Was that a yeah?
I think so.
Yeah. That sounds about right.
It's also pretty common for guys to plant, alfalfa or cotton or those types of things when in between rows of trees, when trees are saplings.
Oh, really?
While the trees aren't producing, instead of having the ground just be fallow, they plant something like smaller, lesser value crop in their wheat, alfalfa, whatever.
So you can get something while you're waiting 2-3 years. All right. That's clever. So there we go. I'll add that for next year. So for people listening to the lecture who didn't hear that, it was mentioned that sometimes growers will grow alfalfa or some sort of lower yielding crop in between young tree rows. All right. And then there's the idea of trap cropping, which is sort of what's going on in that alfalfa system, where you plant a crop that is more attractive to pests next to your higher value crop. So you attract the pests into that one that's more attractive, and then you can basically perform your control on that attractive crop, or you could just leave it and accept it as a loss if it's something like alfalfa. And then in the alfalfa system, they do something even more clever, which is that the growers will harvest the alfalfa, but they'll only harvest about half of it at a time, so that way you don't remove all of the alfalfa the lygus are hiding in, because then they'll all migrate back to the cotton. So you harvest half of it, the lygus from the harvested half will move over to the unharvested, and then as the field grows back up, they'll move out and spread again. You'll harvest the half that you didn't harvest before. You just keep switching back and forth, making sure the lygus has an alfalfa habitat to stay in. And crop rotation, or the intentional planting of a specific crop sequence to improve the overall crop health. Right? So going back to Thomas Jefferson and all that jazz, the idea that certain crops use different nutrient profiles, and so by rotating your crops back and forth, you can keep the soil having a higher nutrition profile and sort of keep it nice and sustainable. On the flip side, because pests are oftentimes adapted to a single crop, by rotating out their crop of choice and replacing it with a non-host, you basically create a desert for them, a food desert. And so you're removing a specific resource, you're disrupting their life cycle, and you're knocking them out of the loop, right? Now, something to keep in mind is that rotation only works in certain pests, and they need to have specific requirements. So the pest needs to originate in the field, and they need to be unlikely to move from that field to a surrounding area. So essentially, they need to be relatively immobile. So this works really well on soil-borne pests, nematodes, insects that have a soil feeding phase, like feeding on roots, those sorts of ideas. And this makes sense from the perspective of if they don't originate in the field, like if you have pests moving in from weedy borders, or if you have pests moving in from the foothills or something, rotating your crop's not going to do a whole lot. Either you have the crop they feed on, or you don't. Oh, there we go. Soil-borne or immobile, which I think is more of an add-on from the originate the field and are likely to stay there. They need to have a very narrow host range, right? So essentially, you want to have a pest that feeds on a specific type of plant or a very specific family of plant, so that you have lots of options of things to rotate to that they can't actually feed on. And then finally, you need a pest that cannot survive more than a few years without the host, because you don't want to rotate out and know that you can't replant that host for like 10 years, which is what's problematic with some nematodes. Lots of nematodes can just hang out and assist, for a long time. Lots of fungi can just sort of hang out as spores and not emerge. And so those are pests that rotation doesn't work super great against. Probably the most successful version of crop rotation, the one that's the most widely known, is sort of the corn-soybean rotation out in the Midwest. This is primarily used to control any number of the rootworms. Western corn rootworms probably the most prolific, right? But so this pest has a specific life cycle where the adults lay their eggs in the soil over the winter. In the spring, the eggs hatch. The larvae crawl through the soil and feed on the corn roots. When they pupate, they emerge as adults. Adults fly up onto the corn, feed on the silks. Sometimes they'll feed on the kernels, feed on the pollen, cause all sorts of annoying problems. And then they'll lay their eggs again, and it repeats. But they really like corn. They don't like eating a whole lot else. So it's been traditional to just rotate in a legume. So this could be any number of crops. Currently, it's soybeans that are super popular, since soybeans are easy to grow and relatively high value. And the idea being that the eggs hatch, there's no corn to feed on, and because these guys are crawling through the soil, they can't move, to the next field over to get to that corn. Now, the problem was that corn hit peak prices, back in the mid-2000s? Corn was going, back in the ethanol craze, corn was going for like 2 or 3 times the amount it is now. And so growers stopped rotating. They started growing what we call continuous corn. So you had growers growing corn like 8 years in a row, never rotating out, and just sort of relying on having tons of nitrogen to dump into the soil to keep it going. And so what ultimately happened is that Western corn rootworm developed resistance to rotation, which was kind of interesting. They, on one hand, you had some fields where they didn't have to worry about rotation, so they just fed all the time. And on the other hand, you had some of them develop the ability that in fields where they did rotate, that they would actually preferentially lay their eggs in soybean fields, because the next year those soybeans would be replaced with corn. So they had a different preference for their overwintering site. So rootworms are pretty interesting. So one thing to keep in mind is when you're rotating, just make sure that when you rotate to a different family of plants. Generally, plant families share about the same pest profile. So if you have beans, you want to rotate to something that is not a legume, right? Because even if you rotate to a different crop, it's possible that that crop has some crossover in pest community. So generally, you want to go to very different crop classes when you're doing these rotations. So the last 3 we have here are cultural methods that you can do after you've already got stuff in the ground. Sort of best management practices when you already have your crop growing in order to reduce pests. And these fall into the area of basically modifying your dates, the irrigation, and the fertilization regimes. So again, these aren't particularly novel ideas, but it is the idea that for planting and harvesting dates, that the time you choose to plant, the time you choose to harvest, you can basically time those out so that you avoid pest problems. Pests are going to be worse at certain times of year, certain degree day accumulations. So by planting early or late, you can make sure that your crop hits its most vulnerable developmental stage at a time when pest populations are the lowest. And so you'll hear recommendations for certain regions to plant, like 2 weeks earlier than you normally would in order to miss out on the very worst. Alternatively, these can also be used. I already kind of said that. But anyway, so basically, like I mentioned, avoiding the peak pest activities. A good example of a really successful program with this is the San Joaquin Valley Plowdown program. So essentially, they don't allow you to plant before 320, primarily because this is the time of year when the pink bollworm is the most active. It's in its first flight. It's looking for hosts. So by not having any hosts available to it, you're going to knock down that first generation really hard. On the flip side, this is also a really good example of sanitation, because the plowdown also has mandatory harvest dates and sanitation requirements. And what that's all oriented around is also this pink bollworm that you're trying to remove its overwintering host by not leaving a whole bunch of residue in the field that they can hang out in. And then as just another example, you have the case of very heavy infestations of nematodes. If you're growing things like potatoes, things that are underground, carrots and the like, early harvest oftentimes can reduce those peak nematode populations and the damages associated with them. So you might take a hit from not having the biggest potatoes, but you might come out ahead just because you don't have potatoes riddled with nematodes. All right, irrigation and water management. There's really two major aspects to irrigation and pest control. On the one hand, there's this idea that we keep coming back to, which is that if you have stressed out plants, they're going to be stressed. They're going to be dedicating a lot of energy to keeping themselves alive, and that's energy that they can't dedicate to fighting pests. So stressed plants tend to have more pest problems. And oftentimes, the type of stress will influence the type of pest problems you will see. If you've got a system where you're over-irrigating, you get what you would expect. You get a lot more fungal diseases, Phytophthora, root rot, crown disease, lots of weeds that use a lot of water but are hard to control. And on the flip side, if you have things like sandy conditions that stress out plants because they're overly dry, you're going to get things that feed on drier plants. You're going to get pathogens. You're going to get boring pests, spider mites, those sorts of things. And then on the flip side, there are some programs where you can use irrigation actually as a form of pest control because you disrupt certain aspects of their life cycle. With diamondback moth, what you can do is if you use an overhead sprinkler system, you can turn on that sprinkler system right at dusk during mating periods, and diamondback moths won't fly in the rain. They just don't do it. And so basically by simulating rain during the mating period, you disrupt mating, you get a whole lot less egg lay, you get a whole lot less of a second generation in your crop. And then on the flip side, soil-borne insects oftentimes are susceptible to flooding. So if you just flood irrigate early in the season, you can oftentimes take out a lot of larvae in those particular types of systems. See a little bit of writing. Right. And then finally, fertilizers and soil amendments is the last one, I believe. It's the same idea as the first part of irrigation. Healthy plants have more pest tolerance, right? And so fertilizing, while it may also increase generally the growth of your plants, the amount of output you get, you may also be increasing the amount of pest resistance. And again, stress plants are susceptible. However, there are some cases where over-fertilization is a problem. So by fertilizing the plants, you increase the amount of available nitrogen to various organisms. And in a lot of pests, nitrogen is the limiting growth factor. They're basically out there looking for nitrogen. That's what they want, because carbon, oxygen, phosphorus, all those things are relatively easy to get by comparison. So if you over-fertilize, you get all this excess nitrogen, and you'll see certain pests that tend to pop up in higher numbers then. In particular, hemipterans. Hemipterans feed on sap primarily, and sap is like maple syrup. It's almost all sugars. There's not a whole lot of nitrogen in it. So if you bump up the nitrogen in the sap, you're going to bump up your number of hemipterans. On the flip side, there's also been studies showing that certain fungal pathogens like brown rot, as well as moths, the oriental fruit moth and the peach twig borer, also tend to increase in population when you have heavily fertilized crops. So with that, we'll call that a day. Next week, we will move into mechanical control as compared to cultural. And that is it. Have a nice weekend. I will see the Thursday group in about 45 minutes.